Shalom Aleichem and welcome. So now that we have the general background of when you need shtei chaysamis and when you need a chaysam echad, and primarily it also has two or three levels. One level is where you're sending the food with a guy. Another level is lahavdil if you're sending it with a yid who is not trustworthy for whatever reason. And then we have a difference if you are what the type of food you're sending. Are you sending an Isser Dairaisa? Are you sending a possible swap of an Isser D'Rabbanan? Are you sending it with him or are you depositing it to him? What's the difference? Because when you're sending it, you are not the one who is getting it from the other end. There is more chance for hanky-panky that way. When you deposit it and you yourself pick it up, it could be a slightly easier. And this to get the rundown, the crash course about when you need chaysam echad, when you need shtei chaysamis, you must listen to the Akdamash here, which I posted on the WhatsApp. Somebody's mic is on. Okay, Shalom Greenwald. However, today we're going to actually learn what is a chaysam, what would be considered a chaysam echad, and what makes it two chaysamis. What is very fascinating is this concept is you'll find I think it's in 4 places over the next 4 seifim that the Ramah says that this is a copy. Look at Ramah Siv Beis. The last 5-6 words in the Ramah is Ayin Lekaman Saif Simon Kuf Lamed. You want to know about Chaysam Echad Shtei Chaysamis? Look at Simon Kuf Lamed. Look in the Ramah and Siv Gimel. The last words of Siv Gimel is also, he says, Siv Zeh, everything I just was written in this Siv is kaful, is doubled, is a copy later on in Simon Kuf Lamed Siv Vav. You go to Siv Dalid, also the Ramah says Gam Zeh Kaful Sham. That's also copied later on in Simon Kuf Lamed. What's going on in Simon Kuf Lamed? In Simon Kuf Lamed, it might be a little higher, stronger chashash. Over there, it's all the dinim of wine. Now, by wine, as mentioned in my Akdamash here, we have an extra chashash. Mishum chibas nisuch. Mishum chibas nisuch means maybe the guy has a special urge to show honor to his getchke, and he got himself a urge to do nesech. So for there, that extra desire to want to serve his getchke might make him break certain things to get it done, which he wouldn't do for any other food. But either way, in Simon Kuf Lamed, when it talks about delivering wine, it speaks about how you could send the wine through a goyish trucking, a goyish service. When do you know that the same wine that you, as the kosher winemaker, has made arrives in the other place when you're not there? So a lot of these dinim that I'm going to teach today, as the Ramah himself mentions, is doubled, is copied in wine, in Simon Kuf Lamed. But over here, obviously, when we're talking about all foods, all kosher foods, the same question comes up. So you could learn it from both ends. So let's start off with Siv Gimel. In Siv Gimel, I will primarily talk about Peh, and then we'll rush through it inside. We already know that certain food items, which is very tempting for the guy to swap, and it's an Isser Dairaisa, you have to have 2 seals. Certain items, it's only 1 seal. So the Mechaber brings different things. What would that be considered? 1 seal or 2 seals? So, for example, the opening of Siv Gimel, he says, Ois Achas, a Jewish letter, a Jewish alphabet letter, chashuv k'chaisim echad. If you place a Jewish letter on the item that's being shipped, then because normally in the good old-fashioned times, the goyim didn't know how to write our letters, so that is a good enough proof to be considered as one chaisim. Now, if you put shtayim, if you put two letters, now that would take the guy twice as hard to play around with this. So two letters would be considered shtei chaisamis. Now, I'm sure you're all thinking, excuse me, it's so easy. Today's days, obviously, it's very easy when it's not written and it's computerized. But let's talk about just facts as it's brought in Shulchan Aruch. First of all, before you get too trigger happy, the Mechaber himself goes on to say that a letter at the end of the Mechaber says, Yesh Ayman, there are those that say, Shebemakim Shemitzuim Mumrim Vekusim Sheyoidim Lichtov, if there are Goyim or Lahavdil Yidden who went off the path, who know how to write Jewish letters, then letters don't mean anything because it could easily be forged, redone. But let's go back to the original concept that a letter is considered a chaisim. Now over here, all the Mechaber says it's considered a chaisim. Later on, actually, in Siman Kuf Lamed, where I told you it's repeated more in detail, over there the Ramah says it's not just a letter on it. The letter, if it's placed in a certain way, then it's very hard to break. For example, the Ramah says the food is in a box, the food is in a bag or something like that, and it's covered, and the letter is written on it or stamped on it in such a way, half is on the cover and half is on the food, half is on the cover and half is on the keli, the bottom part. So if the keli would have been open, it would have broken the letter, and the guy doesn't necessarily know how to replace it. So the Ramah adds that detail, and that would be a proof how a letter, if it's in a place where a guy doesn't know the letters, then a letter would be considered one chaisim. I mentioned before, the Mechaber goes on to say that if the guy know or if they could get their hands onto Jewish letters, then that would not be a raya. That would not be a chaisim. Now, the Mechaber later on in Siman Kuf Lamed Se'iv Vav, the Mechaber actually agrees with that Yesh Omrim. Over here he says V'yesh Omrim, that there is an opinion that holds that if a guy knows the letters, then it wouldn't be a chaisim. It wouldn't be considered a good enough proof. But usually the term V'yesh Omrim is like, I don't hold like that, but I just want you to know there is an opinion like that. Yet in Siman Kuf Lamed Se'iv Vav, the Mechaber clearly paskins like that. So why does he say it over here in a way of a yesh omrim? So there are different ways to explain the diuk of why he uses the term yesh omrim here. But I'm not going to go into the lumdas. The Chachmas Adam says that today's days, a letter would not necessarily prove anything because there are many people, there are many ways how there are goyim or lahavdil, non-religious Yidden who know the letters and they can easily forge their way. So a letter would not be any proof as a chaisim. So the Mechaber begins, one letter would be one chaisim, two letters would be considered two chaisamis. The mind nafkimina, because there are certain food items that you need one chaisim is enough, and then you could eat when it comes to you, because if it wasn't broken, you could assume that it wasn't tampered with. If you need two chaisamis, two letters would be good enough. Now, there is a very interesting discussion here. The Taz in Siman Aleph, in Hilchas Shchita, in Siman Aleph, Sif Katan Tezvav, the Taz says a very interesting thing. Here we're talking about letters might be considered a proof. So the Taz over there discusses, how about the words kosher, chaf, shin, resh? Is that considered a proof? And obviously in Hilchos Shchita he's talking about meat. How do you know that the meat that's being handled and moved around and there is goyim, if they put the word kosher on that, would that be considered a proof? So the Taz in Sif, again, in Hilchos Shchita, Siman Aleph, Sif Katan Tezvav says that the word kosher, because that's a common word and goyim know how to write it, it is not considered a siman. You know, according to what the Mechaber says here, it's only if you find goyim that know how to write. The word kosher, this reminds me of the famous story. They say that there's some bachrim that went to America shlichus to find some Jews in South Africa 30, 40 years ago. So they were looking for some random community area to find Jews. So they went to the cemetery to see if there's any Jewish names. So they saw one matzeva. They saw a tombstone that said the words kosher lepesach in it. So they figured it must be Jewish. So they asked, why did it say, what kind of name is kosher lepesach? And they found out that the person passed away was not living a religious life, but he wanted to make sure that the people know that he's Jewish. He must have had a box of matzah, a shevetz matzah, and he wanted some Hebrew words on his matzeva. So he said, put these words on. Little did he know the words were kosher lepesach. But it's the word kosher, according to the Taz, is not a siman, and some achronim say, according to that, then the letters chaf, shin, and resh should not be considered a siman either, because if you say kosher, those letters they know, then those letters are disqualified. There is another interesting shaila, and this is brought in the Chelkas Binyamin. The Chelkas Binyamin speaks about, the Mechaber says that a letter, each letter is considered a chaysim. If there's one letter, it's chaysim echad. If it's two letters, it's shtei chaysamis. How about a letter that's halves? Two halves. What do you mean two halves? The letter hey and the letter kuf, they have two halves. So for him to play around and tamper with it, it should almost be as difficult as tampering with two letters. So would the letter hey and the letter kuf, would that be considered as shtei chaysamis or chaysam echad? So in the Chelkas Binyamin, he holds that even though it's two parts, it's still, each one is still considered one letter. And the proof that he brings to this, to prove it, is the next part in the Mechaber. The Mechaber says, defusim is a mold, is a print. Even if that mold, that print that you stuck on, you stamped on, even though there are many letters, but because it's one form, it's in one mold, it's all considered chaysam echad. It's not considered like he has to break two chaysamas. So he uses, the Chelkas Binyamin uses that as a rayas, madoch, many letters on a mold, on a stamp, is as many letters as they may be. They're all considered chaysam echad because they're on one stamp. So a letter that has two parts is not better than a mold, than a stamp that has many letters. All right. Based on the case that we just learned, that a stamp that has many letters is considered like one chaysam, so it is brought from the Meiri, and the Kaf HaChaim quotes this, that if a person has kosher food and he sticks a paper on the food and he writes a bunch of stuff in there, so he's writing many letters, but it's all on one paper, just like the defusim, the mold, the stamp, even if there's many letters, one stamp, many letters is considered one chaysim. A paper that even if you wrote on the paper many words, it's all considered chaysim echad. Now, even that it is considered a chaysim, the fact that you're even considering a sticker or stamp a chaysim, that's only if the sticker is not easy to be peeled off and replaced. If the sticker is easy, you could easily replace it, then you could write Megillas on it. It won't even be considered one chaysim. It's only considered a chaysim with as many words as you may put on it. It's still considered one chaysim if it cannot be peeled off and replaced. Again, this is the Kaf HaChaim says. If it's easily replaced, then you can write Megillah on it. Whatever, not necessarily what you see is what you got. And it wouldn't even be considered one chaysim. So this is all a summary of Siv Gimel. What may be considered a chaysim and what not. Now, in Siv Dalid, he goes on to more examples of what is considered one chaysim, what will be considered shtei chaysamis. It's interesting because we over there, when you learn Hilchas Yayin Nesech, as mentioned over there, it's a little more scary, a little more, you have to be a little more careful. So he wants that whenever you need shtei chaysamis, it's not just two separate things surrounded. It has to be sometimes it has to be a chaysim b'toy chaysim. It has to be one within the other. So it's almost impossible to be tampered with. To have two separate ones is still a little easier. Over here, you don't find the concept of chaysim b'toy chaysim. You just find that it has to, the isurei da'iraisa need shtei chaysamis. So in Siv Dalid, he goes on to discuss Mafteach v'chaysim. There are some cases where you need two chaysamis, right? In Sif Aleph it says a isur dairaisa that a guy will benefit by swapping. The only way you could eat it in your end when you get it from a guy if there is two chaysamis. So in Sif Dalit he goes on to say if it's a mafteach, if it was closed and the key and it's locked, that would be considered one chaysim. And if the food or the box has a chaysim on it, now you have shtei chaysamis. If it's a type of food that needs shtei chaysamis, the key, in other words, if it was in a container, in a shipping container, that there's a lock. So what are you suspecting? That the guy came and made a copy of a key and broke it and what's it called? What's the word in English? When you copy the key, you got in, he got in, took his stuff and replaced it. That's already hard. And on top of that, there was another chaysim that would be considered shtei chaysamis. Now, the Chachamim believe that a key is easier to copy than all other things that we do. All other chaysamis that we mention, the Chachamim believe that a key, it's easier to replace. It's easier to make. So therefore, if you need one chaysim, a key is not considered good enough because it's a pretty easy thing to break open a lock and fix it or find a copy of a key. That's pretty easy. If you need one chaysim, a key is not considered a good chaysim. If, however, you need two chaysamis, then if the other chaysim is a good chaysim, then the key would satisfy us as a second one. Would satisfy us as a second. Now, The Shach says this, but many people have a problem. Many places can question it based on the shita of the Ramah of Sif Aleph, if it makes a difference between a Yisrael Chashid and a Goy, but I'm not going to discuss it right now. So again, the Mechaber and Sif Dalet says, Amafteach a key, if you have a key with another chaysim, that would be considered shtei chaysamis. If you're only using the mafteach, you're putting a Isser D'Rabbanan in a box, and you're locking it with a key, that would not be considered good enough, because a key is easy to forge. However, the Chachmas Adam says that in a Hefsid Meruba, if a food item was delivered and the only chaysim you have is the key, that the fact that the Yid locked it and had a key, he says, fine. Sometimes I would consider even a key as a good enough proof that you should be able to eat it. You should be able to keep the food that ends up on the other side. So now we spoke about a key, and we spoke about chaysim echad shtei chaysamis. Now you have to know that later on, and the Pri Chadash discusses this, that some say there's a difference between a wooden key and a metal key. A metal key. Some say that a wooden key, some say metal is easier to make it forge and make a copy of a key. Wood is more difficult. Some say the other ones. But the bottom line is that's a machlekes. If there's a difference between the different types of kalim, the Achrayim say today's days, copying keys is not that easy, and you have to find a special ganiv who's able to just break in and copy the key. So some Achrayim say the Kaf HaChaim, and he says that today's days our keys are better than the Shulchan Aruch's keys, and therefore our keys would be considered a chaysim. Even in a case where you only need one chaysim, a key would be good enough. What does the Ramah go on to sif in Simin in Ramah in Seif Dalid? He goes on to bring another example. What happens if you're sending kosher food with a goyish service, and the food is in a sack, in a bag, in a sack, and you made a seal on the bag? Would that be considered good enough? So the Ramah says, Im shayleach ezer davar b'sak. If you sent with a sack, food in a sack, v'chasam hashak, einoi afilu k'chaysim echad. That is nada. That is no proof whatsoever, because it's very easy for the guy to undo the stitches of the bag, take out the food, put his food back in, and stitch it back in, stitch back the bag together. So whether the fact that you had a chaysim doesn't stop him. It's easily able to swap the food. The only way it would be considered a chaysim, says the Ramah, ela im kain tafar hatfirais lifnim, unless he made the stitches in the inside of the bag. So because the stitches were in the inside of the bag, if the guy would have to rip the bag, it would be very noticeable. And then the replacement of the stitches will be obvious. That would be a siman. Then the chaysim was good enough. But if the stitches are a regular bag from the outside, you can make a chaysim on the outside. The chaysim would not stop the guy from doing anything. Then the Ramah concludes, how about im chasam hadavar shesholach v'gam asak? If he made two seals, one on the food that's in the bag, and one on the outside of the bag. Now, this is a machlokes, the Gra and the Pri Chadash. Is he talking about with the stitches on the outside, or this is only when the stitches on the inside? But either way, he's saying if there's one chaysim on the food and one chaysim on the bag, that would be considered twice as hard for the guy to swap. That would have a din of shtei chaysamas. Now, this is as far as the Ramah gives examples of Mechaber and the Ramah. What would be considered one chaysim? What would be considered shtei chaysamas? Later on in Siman Kuf Lamed, again over there it talks about the wine. In Siv Dalet and Hay, the Mechaber brings more things that would be considered a chaysim. For example, let's say that the box was shut, closed in a very weird way. I don't have an example. Let's say he used purple rope. I don't know, something like that. If the box was the barrel was plastered in a very weird way, then some say that would be considered a chaysim, because that would be very funny for the guy. Even if he opens it, he has to make this whole design or do it in the unique way that the Yid did it. That wouldn't be considered. That wouldn't be too much fun for him. So therefore, that would also be considered a chaysim. Which reminds me of later on, there's a very funny din. Later on, there's a very similar din where it speaks about a halacha like this. What happens if, which halacha am I talking about? A type of food that goyim don't make. Let's say gefilte fish. So I saw a very interesting thing. Oh, here it is. It's actually right over here. The Paiskim write, this is brought from the Pri Chadash and Sifkat Mem Aleph. Let's say there is a type of food that goyim don't know how to make. Let's say gefilte fish. Or even if the guy would take the chance, take the risk, and take my gefilte fish and replace it with what he made, it's going to obviously look different. It's going to be chalashis. So again, the Pri Chadash and Sifkat Mem Aleph says that, you know what? In a case like that, the food itself might be scary enough for the guy not to play around with it. As we see later on, that there's different meats that if it was cut in a certain way, if it gets to the other end cut that way, we know that's the original meat. So if you send a loaf of gefilte fish and the guy has no idea how to make gefilte fish, then some say, again, I quoted from the Pri Chadash, he says goyim don't play around with items like that because it's very risky, because they could easily be caught. So what is not mentioned by us is a closing, a plaster, or you did a special way how to close the box, then the guy wouldn't play around with it. Or some add, what would be the din if a Yid took a, what is it called? The old-fashioned suitcases, those, no? What are those suitcases? They didn't have suitcases. What do they have? No, those big boxes. What were they called? A trunk. Like, what's if a guy took a Yid took a trunk, filled it up with food, and knocked a wooden trunk and closed it shut with nails, and closed it heavily shut with nails. Now, some say this is actually brought from the Aruch HaShulchan, I think, that if he knocked it shut with a lot of nails, which would be a big tircha for him to bust it open, would also be considered a chosem. The discussion which some achronim deal with, how about if I sent a food item with a specific scale, a specific measurement? I sent 10 pounds of cholent. 10. So and it's exactly 10 pounds. Would that be considered enough scare for the guy, even if he takes some cholent and replaces it? Is he going to realize that it has to be exactly 10 pounds? Would mishko, would weight be enough of a scare to chase the guy away? Would that be considered a chosem? So in Shilas Teshuvas Beis Shloima Siman Kuf Pei Zayin, he says that weight is not such a, I can't be 100% sure that scares him away, because maybe he'll take and replace it and just manage to put it on the scale. Just like weight doesn't scare him away, in the same sefer, he discusses even number. If there's a certain amount of pieces of food that you have there, what are you going to say? Maybe he took some and he didn't realize that he has to put back exactly the same number. Nah, that doesn't scare him. So weight and number would not be an amount will not be considered a chosem. So it's only specifically these items that will scare him away. So this is a summary of Seif Gimel and Dalid of what is one chosem and what is two chosemes. Now you go back to Seif Beis. When you go back to Seif Beis, you come up with another discussion. And the discussion you come back is, what's the din if you made you did the right thing, you packaged the food in such a way that you left a chosem, and you sent it off with a guy, or if the items need shtei chosemes, you did a shtei chosemes, you sent it off with a guy. You sent it off. You are selling food. You're not there when it arrives by the buyer. Incidentally, I don't know if I mentioned this in the previous year. If somebody comes to your store and buys from you kosher food, and he pays you the bill, and then you send it with a delivery service that he can't use it now because you didn't do the proper chosem or shtei chosemes, some say that the seller is responsible to pay because he damaged this food now, because now it's inedible, because it's lacking the chosem or shtei chosemes. So, but if you did do what you're supposed to do, you did do the chosem or you did do the shtei chosemes, you don't have to come, make sure and pick up a phone and ask the guy, hey, did he get it that way? Did you get it exactly? Because the actual act of having a chosem there or having shtei chosemes there, we strongly believe scares the guy away. So if the guy gets his delivery, he sees, vaguely looks, everything looks nicely. So he sits. He doesn't have to do any more. Whether or not it's an Isser D'Oraisa or it's an Isser D'Rabbanan, he can eat the food. If, however, the guy who sends it, Chazar Al Chaisamai, he came to the place where it was delivered, and he's looking for his seal, V'lohi Kiroi, and he doesn't recognize anything that he left. This makes more sense when you're transporting a lot. He doesn't recognize any of the simanim that he would have placed there. Then the Mechaber says, Asur afilu b'shtei chosemes. Even if he made shtei chosemes, at least one of them he remembers it's not good, because once he sees hanky-panky, the thing is gone. Now, this is what the Mechaber says here. The Ramah in Siman Kuf Lamed, Seif Ches, adds a condition. He says the tampering is only something that concerns you when you have no other reason to believe something else did it. Let's say you know that there was a very bumpy ride and the boxes were shaking. You know that the food that you sent, something happened. You know for a fact that something happened that something else could have made this thing open up. Then the Ramah in Siman Kuf Lamed Seif Ches says, as long as you did what you were supposed to do when you sent it off, and that scares the guy away, and on top of that, even though you find it different at the other end, but because you know the reasons, there are other reasons why it could have happened, that alone allows you to eat that food and not suspect that the guy swapped it. So that is Siv Beis. But the Ramah adds one more thing by saying that this whole swapping business that we have to suspect the guy, that's only if there's a chash that he's nana bechalipin. Nana bechalipin means that the guy has reason to exchange it. The food that's there is very tempting to him, or it's very expensive, and he can exchange it for some junk. But if not, then there's much less reason to suspect any issues with the guy. Now we basically covered if Bay, Aleph Bay. If the recording, the first recording I put on the WhatsApp is a beautiful summary of Sif Aleph. Now we have Bay's Gimel Dalid. Hey, we learned already. There are certain things that you don't necessarily need a siman because the item itself is cut. The item itself is proven. You could recognize by the item itself that it's still the original item because the guy won't play around. The cut, the things that are missing are the things that Jews take out. And Siv Vav, it talks about just the fact that it was shechted. Shchita is not considered any chaysim. And Siv Zayin, he went on to say that perhaps there is another heter, and the other heter is that it went through the delivery service, went through a public place. And if it went through the whole road, went through always through a public place, then the guy never would have had a chance to feel comfortable to swap things. That would be another reason how you could trust him for what he did, even if there's very little proof, very little evidence that he wouldn't do it.